Well, we ate our Wheaties and we're back for another list show, and it's another 25 of them, Mike. But this time, stuff we talk about a lot, which is kind of most influential game systems. So both consoles and handhelds. From Den of Geek, they, as their criterions, we talked a little bit before the show began, and Mike had indicated he was surprised in a couple of the entries. I was surprised at the location of a couple of the entries. Um, but their criteria, and this may be why we're confused, is the factors they took into account were the historical impact of the game, which could be influenced by the sales degree, but just historical impact in general, the quality of the library of games, the reliability of the system, and then just kind of the generic innovation or that type of thing. So things where they were kind of coming up with creative ideas. So those were the factors they took in to create their list, which is why we may see a couple of these interesting stragglers on here. But thought we kind of run on through this again. Um, Maybe what we can do is I'll go and lead off here and start talking about the links a little bit, and you can share some thoughts. And then when we come to the next one, you can kick it off. We'll just kind of go back and forth that way. That work for you?
Sounds good. I would also let everybody know too, if you haven't watched our previous list shows, you definitely should. And while the chances of us talking about babies crowning is low, it's never zero.
Hopefully, hopefully this is a crown free episode, but I don't know. See if we break the streak. So the Atari Lynx, number 25 on their list. I always thought I don't know how necessarily playable it was as a handheld, whether the design could be better, but I thought it kind of looked cool. The screen to plastic ratio is a little bit off, but it's a that's kind of a creature of its time, I think, a little bit there. But it was, kind of up against the Game Boy. So the two challenges, two very different approaches. Um, Battery life seemed to be the biggest knock against it, but it was a pretty impressive entry in the handheld market. Your thoughts?
So right off the bat, I was surprised to see this on the list. This is something, I mean, it's nice to see it. It's not something that gets talked about a lot, but I mean, isn't the list like the most important game consoles? So I don't know the impact that this had. That's not to say it wasn't important. I mean, to Kelly's point, it did some pretty impressive stuff. Uh, some of the sprite work on there was really interesting. There's some great Lynx games. Dracula is one of my favorites, and while I'm not a dodgeball fan, there's a serviceable dodgeball game on here and a few other really good games. You can actually get if you don't want to emulate, because obviously we don't do that here. We just play actual original hardware. But if you don't want to emulate and you don't want to put out the money for original hardware, which you can still get, I've seen a few of these in a wild. Um, you can get the Evercade Atari Lynx collections. There are actually two of those. So you can pick up some of the better games on there and some handy collections. Yeah, it had bad battery life and cost more than the Game Boy, so the Game Boy absolutely crushed it in the actual marketplace. I did see a couple of these back when I was a kid. There were a couple people who had them, so it wasn't like that obscure. What I never saw in the wild, though, that does exist and should have been the picture they used, is the Marlboro cigarettes branded Atari Lynx.
Yeah, I was surprised that wasn't the model they used either. I mean, I guess the other kind of in the innovation side, early multiplayer handheld kind of stuff. You could connect them up. I mean, you could really connect up Game Boys too, but it was almost a little more data sharing than multiplayer. But I mean, that was another kind of interesting thing. But I do think they missed the mark by not having the branded cigarette version of this. Always
It's
good
also,
to.
and I always forget until I come across one in the wild. It is kind of unwieldy looking when you actually see it in person. To Kelly's point about the plastic ratio, it's a big beast of a system.
Yep, most definitely. All right. Good one for you to lead off on. The Neo Geo.
The Neo Geo, the AES, not the MVS. So the Neo Geo MVS was an arcade system that SNK created that would allow arcades to have cabinets that would save floor space by having multiple cartridges in there instead of a hard drive that was dedicated that they would have to switch out the whole unit or do like a full teardown and rebrand of a cabinet. For things like that, they could have four cartridges at a time that they could just pop into this Neo Geo that was basically just a console inside the arcade cabinet, which is what Nintendo later claimed they were doing with a Nintendo 64 for a couple games, but we'll get there. Um, it was really cool, and SNK had the idea that, since this is just a console with cartridges, they could make a home version, which is the AES, that was actually originally only released as a rental system. So you could rent these from video stores and things like that. They had a gigantic price tag. I think it was like $700 or $800 or something back
That
in early '90s money.
Yeah, in 1990, 650, which
Yeah.
translates into basically 1500 in today's money.
Yeah. And the games themselves, the actual cartridges were like $300 and $400 for it at the time that they came out. But you have to remember that what you were getting with this was the actual arcade game, not a port of the arcade game, the actual arcade game. And they made some tweaks for the home version, the AES. It's just one cartridge slot, obviously. And the games would have, menus and things like that you wouldn't have access to in the arcade. But otherwise, you were playing the actual arcade game at home. And, it did move out to where you could buy these. I did not know anyone who owned one at the time. Not until a cheaper CD based version of it came out later. And there was also a great Neo Geo handheld that just didn't really get a whole lot of support in America. But I was a big Neo Geo fan, still am. I got the Neo Geo X Gold that came out a while back. It was actually kind of one of the first mini consoles and really a prelude to what Nintendo did with the Switch later. It was a handheld that was inside the Neo Geo system, and you would dock the handheld and be able to play games on your TV, or you could just pull it off and play it as a handheld. A lot of people did not like the system. There was some issues with the emulation and things like that on there, but I got to have an actual Neo Geo that was full size. It really wasn't a mini console like we're used to now. Uh, and I didn't pay thousands of dollars for it, so that was cool. But you can play these games in collections for almost any platform at this point, whether it's Steam, PlayStation, Xbox, on your Switch. There is a Neo Geo Mini. You can even buy a three-quarter scale Neo Geo cabinet.
There you go. Good stuff. All righty. ColecoVision. Pretty much, I think, and the main reason this was on this game, and it was kind of a gutsy move, is the pack-in game for ColecoVision was Donkey Kong. And so that probably helped sell a few units. I have always, and even though Donkey Kong is not a Coleco product, it's IP they licensed to include, I will always connect Coleco to Donkey Kong because for my 2600, I've got the Coleco Donkey Kong cartridge, and Coleco's prominently displayed on there. And so it's like, well, of course, they're the Donkey Kong merchant and all that. But I mean, kind of an Intellivision looking sort of thing, strange-ish controller, uh, decent gameplay for the time. But this is one I was a little surprised was on the list, with the exception of it, it's probably something that makes the list because of its pack-in game, but I think that's a big reason why. Any thoughts on ColecoVision?
Not too much. I did play a ColecoVision when I was a kid, but as far as older systems, I mean, I grew up with NES, then Genesis, Super Nintendo, all that good stuff. But my uncles and my dad had 2600. I knew a couple of people had Intellivisions, and I think it was a friend of my dad's who had a ColecoVision. So I did play it. I don't have the same memories or nostalgia for it though that I do playing 2600 or Intellivision or anything like that.
Yeah, and in the of course, probably 99% of our viewers won't won't understand this reference, but the cording on it is very much like the old rotary dial telephone cord too, which was always thought kind of weird. But that's a reference that's going to be not useful, I think. So we'll move on. Wonder Swan. Beyond Super Console X exposure to Wonder Swan, I got nothing here. Or very little to say. Um, any Wonder Swan insights from you?
Not really. I knew the Wonder Swan was something that existed because of reading video game magazines, and there was an occasional mention of it. As far as I know, it was only released in Japan, or at least that's where it did all of its business. Um, Emulation is my only exposure to some of the games on there, but even then, I really haven't delved deep into this. I know there's a color version of it as well, just like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but not too much.
Yeah, pretty confident it was a Japanese only release, and it was kind of that pretty good value for the price, but the price is pretty low. So, it's like the quality still kind of tied with the price, but it was still, if you wanted to get into gaming, didn't have a lot of stuff, it was an interesting way to go. Um, Turbo Graphics 16 or PC Engine, depending what you want to call it. Um, a really good arcade quality game system. I mean, in terms of what it could play there. I did think kind of some of the things it suffered from was, if memory serves, if I'm accurate on this, only one controller. I mean, kind of default was one controller port, and you could get a splitter-ish kind of thing for multiplayer, um, it was kind of a lonely man's system. It was one controller system, but with pretty decent quality gameplay.
Yeah, this was kind of an interesting thing. So this is a mostly Japan system. It was called the PC Engine there, and it had multiple iterations and a CD add-on and everything. Never really took off here, and I think part of it is because it was already a year or two old by the time it came out here, and we were getting into Genesis at the time. So a lot of people forget because Genesis had such a long lifespan. The Genesis was actually a competitor for the NES, not the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo didn't come out till a couple, like 2 or 3 years after the Genesis was already on the market. So this suddenly found itself in direct competition with Genesis, which Sega is, for better or worse, is the ones who started the whole, this is how many bits of power we have in there. And the reason that they did it though is, and it makes sense at the time, but this is where it becomes a problem immediately. So it made sense at the time because they were going up against Nintendo, which just had a huge user base, and it was a younger user base. So you were going to have to convince parents to buy another video game system for kids. That would be hundreds of dollars in 1980s money, and that's a hard upsell for something that they already have a system, they already have peripherals, dozens of games for. So they needed a shorthand to explain to parents that this was far more powerful than the NES was. So that's where the 16-bit thing came in to kind of just create this shorthand of, hey, this has twice as much horsepower as the NES does. That's the difference. That's what you're getting a different experience for. This isn't the same thing. So this, which is an 8-bit system, the PC Engine was going to have to be released in that marketplace that Sega had just created. So they decided to call it the TurboGrafx 16 to imply that it was a 16-bit system for the US market. And here's the thing, in a kind of Atari do the math kind of way, it sort of is. So it had a 16-bit video processor. The actual CPU that runs the system is only 8-bit. And this is where, again, they defended this sort of lie by saying they needed to explain to people what the difference between this system and the other ones is. This had, for the time, the largest color palette. So even though it was underpowered compared, it was more powerful, it had more going on than a Nintendo did, but was underpowered compared to the Sega. It actually had a larger color palette, and especially a much larger on-screen color palette than probably both of them put together. So that's where the TurboGrafx 16 came in at. They argued they weren't saying it was a 16-bit system, that they were just talking about the graphics. And in a way, they make a point because you could see the difference in the colors on screen compared to the other systems. It never took off here though, so all of the fighting and the weird math that they were doing didn't really amount to much. It didn't really take off here. There was a couple of games that sold well here and sold some systems, but it just didn't have the longevity here. It's owned by Konami now. Konami was one of the main publishers for it. They produced Hudson Soft, who made NEC Hudson Soft, who made it, and Konami were the main publishers for it. Konami eventually just bought it up, and they own most of the library for it now. So a few years back, they did a TurboGrafx 16 Mini, which was a controversial release. It's almost full size. It is just slightly scaled down compared to the other ones. I have mine in a case next to all my other mini systems that I have in little travel cases, and the travel case is like 3 times as big as all the other mini systems. I think it's like 95% scale or something like that. So just doesn't make sense. One of the weird things with it though is this also had a handheld, the Turbo Duo, which used the exact games from this. So these weren't like ports or anything like that. It was playing the actual TurboGrafx games, which were on their own proprietary media, which were memory cards that they called Hue cards. And then, of course, later they did have CDs. But the Hue cards are one of the things that hurt it. It was something that a lot of people here didn't understand. We're used to cartridges and then later adopting CDs. So the memory cards were weird for people. It also kind of limited the space on games. Um, Unfortunately, because it wasn't as big here, we didn't get the TurboGrafx port of Street Fighter, which was actually technically very, very impressive. And they had to make a special extra large Hue card to hold it. But, weird things like that held it back in the US.
Gotcha. Well, here's a system we've talked about now and again, Sega Saturn.
Yes.
Um, hard to say where it really belongs in the pantheon of things because it really never got a fair shake in terms of how it was rolled out and where how it was rolled out or not rolled out, depending on what you want to say. Good controller on this one. I mean, you're in the Sega controller family at this point in time, but a really good controller. Um, pretty great game system, but it seemed to be more a victim of because this is also during period during heavy marketing and there's people swinging to get your attention, and because of the differences between Sega Japan and United States, which you've talked about a lot, things did not go well for the Saturn.
Yeah, and it's a shame. Like I was a huge, huge Sega fan. It's it's hard to imagine, but there was a video game crash after Atari started going crazy and put out Pac-Man and ET, and they made more copies of ET than there were Atari systems sold because they figured everybody would buy multiple copies. That kind of thinking that drove Atari into the ground and made them literally hide games in landfills and things like that. There was a huge video game crash, and then Nintendo really single-handedly saved video games. So there was really just, even though other systems existed during that time, including other Atari iterations and things, it seemed impossible that anybody would dethrone Nintendo. And Genesis did, especially in the US, for a little while. And it really gave Super Nintendo a run for its money, which again came a few years later, isn't actually the same console generation. I mean, it gets lumped together because they're both 16-bit, but was actually competing with 8-bit systems. So, and technically they're still releasing official Sega published games through the minis and things like that. So it's still going to this day. So it seemed like once Nintendo was there that they were going nowhere. Like they did the impossible. They created a second video game system that people would adopt, and that was it. Like it was those two, that was the two monoliths towering over everything else. So it seemed impossible that Sega would just disappear overnight, and then they did. It was crazy. So to what Kelly was mentioning, which I've talked about here before, Sega of Japan and Sega US were two different companies under the same parent companies who actually were autonomous and developed hardware and software separate from the others, almost competing with the other one, which for a while worked. That's part of what pushed the Genesis forward and gave it such a long lifespan. But then it stopped working when they started intentionally sabotaging each other, basically, which completely derailed the release of the 32X and the Saturn. The Saturn release was botched so badly that some game stores wouldn't even carry it. So it never stood a chance. And it's a shame because it doesn't emulate well. So recently I got a modded Saturn that I've been playing a lot. There's honestly really great games for it, but you can also see problems with it. There's 1,000 processors in it. They were so worried about Sega of Japan, who developed this. Were so worried about Sony that when they would hear the PlayStation was supposedly going to do something else, they would just add another processor and program it to do that. So instead of the streamlined interface of a PlayStation, this is just a Frankenstein's monster of 1,000 chips inside of a box that was apparently very difficult to program for. And they, within months, basically killed all consumer confidence in the company.
PlayStation 3. Um, Kind of sort of known as the worst PlayStation, I think, in terms of
Yeah.
super having direct experience with PlayStation 3. I can tell you they break. They break pretty easily. And it's not due to misuse. They just stop working. There's just all sorts of problems, or you've got to do some uh reinstalls of stuff, and it was kind of a mess. It did it's kind of weird because this comes, there's another PlayStation coming up. There's a couple PlayStations coming up. This was the first one that, correct me if I'm wrong here, this was the first one that could play Blu-ray, which,
Yes.
so this was always helpful for those of us who might be pressed with the question, you're getting another game system. Why? That you could say, well, it's a game system and a DVD player, a Blu-ray player. So I'm getting two things. Blu-rays can be enjoyed by everyone, and then I can enjoy the gaming aspects of it. So I thought it was a sleek, good-looking console, super unreliable. I thought in terms of just just it just wasn't reliable. And wireless controllers, yay, good stuff there. Decent library, but just kind of not not there's better parts of PlayStation history than the three. Your thoughts?
So I don't want to delve too much into the disc part of it because I feel like that's important to talk about when we get to PlayStation 2. But yes, to Kelly's point, Sony really sold themselves as like multimedia devices. Didn't mean a whole lot on PlayStation 1. PlayStation 1 was great, but it also played CDs. But at that point, CD players were commonplace. So it wasn't like that big of a revelation that it could do that. Blu-ray discs were important. There was a format war that was going on between Blu-ray and HD DVD. Sony backed Blu-ray because they were one of the developers of it, and HD DVD was backed by Warner Brothers, who were not one of the developers of it, but hung around until the bitter end. And because of that, most people think that it was just a miscalculation on Warner Brothers' part until they found out what Warner Brothers was working on. Warner Brothers was working with this company called Netflix that I think some people have heard of before to develop streaming movies. So they didn't need HD TV. They didn't need HD DVD to win. They just needed to hold Sony off as long as they could until streaming movies was figured out for everybody to do it. And I know about this for multiple reasons. Warner Brothers distributed this little movie called Evil Bomb that they had absolutely no faith in. So they were like, this crappy movie would be a great test subject for streaming movies. So, and we had kind of swindled Netflix into buying lots of the DVDs for Evil Bond. So they were like, hey, Netflix already knows about this, so we're going to test this streaming on your little stupid movie that nobody cares about. So we're going to put it on our video game system, Xbox, and see if this Xbox, see if it connects with the kids and see what happens. So anyway, I paid my rent off of that for a long time. So it worked out. Thanks, Sony, for this not being the greatest system in the world.
Well played.
Yeah. So yeah, it's and to Kelly's point too. At this time, because I was trying to, I had found discovered the hard way that while touring and working on movies and stuff was fun, I really wasn't getting ahead. I was just treading water because student loan, crushing debt, and all that kind of stuff. So I started getting like part-time jobs because I really didn't want to go back to work, but I started taking part-time jobs. One of which was in an electronics store, so I saw Xbox and PlayStation 3 side by side, and even though PlayStation 3 technically was better, we broke a lot of these just playing them in the displays. That's not a great sign.
No, not at all. Ah, here's a system we have a little familiarity with.
I think I've heard of this.
Yes, 2600. I mean, not much to add. Of course, this should be on a list of the top 25 because
Sure.
it was the one that really brought it to the masses and had a pretty long lifespan. And then they got cocky and they started to do things like Pac-Man and ET. Um, and 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 fell and never were able to get back up, which is, couple noble attempts, but this is the last we'll be seeing of Atari on this list. So their first console is the last console on the list of influential ones. But we're big 2600 fans. Mike's got an album on a 2600 cartridge. Um,
The
there
best and possibly only album ever released on a 2600 cartridge.
could very well be. We're working eventually to have a port of Slapdash for 20 to the 2600. So it's a mover and shaker. And then I mean I guess there has been what would be considered a mild rebound. I don't know what the sales are, but after the VCS attempt that the Atari made kind of on that system, which just kind of seemed to have fizzled out, 2600 plus and now 7800 plus are out and intriguing and interesting. And we'll just kind of see how those go. But they started strong.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, this is probably the most iconic game system. I'm not going to say best, but like Kelly said, I mean, this was for most people. Like this is what introduced gaming to your household. It wasn't the first console, but it was the one that figured it out and how to get into people's homes. It was insanely poorly managed, though. From Pac-Man to ET, they also shot down this small handheld company was working on their first console, and they offered it to Atari, and they were like, "No, we don't want the Nintendo." That blew up in their faces. It's cool though. Nintendo made a very similar mistake as well, on an even bigger, bigger scale with Sony. But yeah, just insanely mismanaged, which I have to assume, given the time frame, cocaine played a huge part in, right?
It's not an unreasonable theory. We'll leave it at that. PlayStation Portable. Nice system. This has the proper screen to plastic ratio too, which is good. So this is a good quality. And this was basically kind of putting a gaming console in your hands, in terms of quality. So uh, it I mean, and it really, precursor to the Switch on some aspects. Uh, it just, never really entirely. I mean, I think it did well, but it went through. But it's definitely worthy of being on this list, and I think a pretty cool system. And if I came across a used one at a reasonable price, I'd probably have a PSP here.
I thought the media for it was pretty interesting. I didn't own one of these myself, but I knew a couple of people who did. I played a handful of games on it. I did enjoy it. I have to be honest overall, though. I'm surprised when I think console, I don't think handhelds. I feel like these are their own separate category. So I was surprised by the amount of handhelds that are on here and some of the choices as well.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that. Um, and that it is kind of, yeah, because it's really consoles and handhelds here that are the type of thing. And and I guess that's why we're not seeing the Virtual Boy show up, because it defies definition in terms of what it is.
It's a list of one.
Yes. Speaking of other handhelds,
Other
definitely
handhelds.
an influence. Game Boy Advance. Uh, I like Game Boy Advance games. I mean, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of crappy ones, but there are also a lot of pretty great ones. Um, and so I've got pretty ample setup on. Got to set up a Raspberry Pi with my Fight Stick, and I've got a cross section of ROMs, which include a very large placed Game Boy Advance library, and they're pretty good games. Um, I didn't have a lot of form factor experience with an actual Game Boy Advance. I think there were some criticisms that, I mean, we're not talking Game Boy screen brightness problem, but there was at least some level of screen brightness problem with the Game Boy Advance, at least for some. But uh, I think it's pretty cool system. Like the look of it. It doesn't look like, it's not usually it's, they're black, and this has got kind of a unique shape to it, nice coloring. So I'm again, to your point about these consoles or handhelds, for things that are either a console or a handheld that matter, makes sense to be on the list, and certainly a good system, I think.
Yeah, Game Boy Advance, I was a huge fan of. I was a big Game Boy guy, not so much Game Boy Color at the time that it came out. Game Boy Color, Nintendo really and still does sort of push the narrative that Game Boy Color is just Game Boy with color. And I think that that's so they could combine the sales numbers for the two of them. Because whenever you see Game Boy sales figures or Game Boy Color sales figures, it's actually the two of them combined. In reality, though, Game Boy Color did have more RAM and larger cartridges and things like that. So I don't know that they're really the same. And I only know that because I don't know if you guys know this. Kelly and I have a line of Game Boy games called Slapdash that you guys should go and play. There's links. You guys should go and play those games. Maybe it'll be out on Game Boy Advance someday. But I loved my Game Boy Advance. To this day, I tell my wife this is one of the greatest gifts ever. She bought me a Game Boy Advance like the day it came out, and I hadn't asked for it or expected it or anything like that. So it was a really cool surprise. Uh, Castlevania Circle of the Night was one of the launch titles for this. Awesome game. I'm a huge fan of the Castlevania series. There's just a bunch of great games released for this. So it was a really surprising system. And, to Kelly's point about with the PSP and kind of bringing more of a console experience home, this predates that. And this brought a lot of that with it as well. There was full motion video in here for the five people who enjoy that. There was movies and TV shows and things released for it as well in cartridges. They didn't look great, but that exists. But there is some great looking games that were released for this as well, and it has a surprisingly large library for a system that was only around for a few years because the DS came not too long after this.
Yeah, the size of the library, given that seems like a game system that's been around for almost 10 years when you look at the size of the library, but it only like three or
Yeah.
4 years because the DS, to your point, came out. Okay, let you kick this off. I'm going to interrupt you right away before you can start talking about it. I don't think this exists. I don't remember this. I believe this is fake. This is fake news. PlayStation Beta? Not in my line of sight whatsoever.
So I knew that this existed. I have never seen one outside of the store. Like I knew quite a few people had PSPs. I would see people on the train with them and things like that. I've never seen a Vita. in the wild.
Yeah, I think it could, you could do like remote play with your PS4 with it, which seems like you really start to niche your market up pretty good at that point. You kind of start with a small subset that makes a big appeal, but I don't think we should talk about it anymore because I don't think it existed. So here's one that I knew existed.
Heard of this one?
Nintendo Wii. Um, so fascinating. Another one that kind of caught, Nintendo swings a lot, and yeah, they almost always make contact, one way or and big. They either go big or they go home in a hurry on some of their stuff. The Wii was a thing for a while. I mean, they did their typical scarcity play, so it's like there's only so many copies, and people have to go. They'd hit the big box stores in the morning. Do you have any? Did any Wii's come in? And so they had that thing going, which is I think a very malicious thing to do, but they did it anyway. I always found I've talked about it on a previous show we've done. I think the biggest benefit of the Wii was it really reduced the barrier of entry for non-gamers. So if you wanted for the family playing a video game together, mom's probably not going to figure out your PlayStation 2 or 3 or your Virtual Boy, but she's gonna figure out this. She's gonna bowl and she's gonna want it, and she's gonna win a game in bowling, and then she's gonna want to play again. And you don't want to tell her you threw the game, so you feel good about it. Sorry, I'm reliving past stuff, but it's a good system, I think. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I remember. So first off, Nintendo forever has been trying to push this motion control thing. This was always their dream. Most people don't remember, but there was motion controls for the NES. They worked with like two games, and worked is there's gigantic air quotes around that as to how well it worked. I don't know if you used any of their motion controls previously, Kelly.
No.
They were not great. The Power Glove is the one that most people think of, which really wasn't a motion control so much as just a controller strapped to your hand. But there was an actual motion controller that I think worked with two games, Punch Out, and I can't remember what the other one was. It was something that didn't make sense with it though. And basically, it was like a box that you would build. And at least for Punch Out, which is the only game I ever saw it used with, you would punch into the box, trying not to hit the box. So you'd punch really slowly as your character on the screen, little Mac, would just be killed because you punch too fast, you were going to hit the box. And if you, or even if it maybe registered it, and even punching slow, it didn't always register your hits. But they made a bunch of swings and misses at motion control. That was the closest one. Um, so when I heard this was coming out, honestly, I didn't really take it very seriously because, again, the motion control thing, putting it right up front, just seemed like a desperate. The way that Sega kept really trying to push interactive movies on people with all of their CD-ROM titles was Nintendo with these motion controls. Also, to Kelly's point, there was such a long period of just domination from Nintendo, and then they did start to kind of falter. Um, Game Boy Color wasn't as widely adopted as the Game Boy was. Um, Virtual Boy did not do well at all. That just crashed and burned. Nintendo 64 did okay, and I have a feeling that's coming up soon. So we'll talk about that when we get there. But Nintendo insisted on sticking with cartridges for it, which actually lost them some really big partners and really big game franchises that were Nintendo exclusive at that point, and gave their competitors an edge over them in that system generation, specifically Final Fantasy, which was a big, big hit to Nintendo. That, as far as people knew, was a Nintendo exclusive title. And to lose that to their biggest competitor was a big deal. So, and GameCube did okay. It has a cult following, but again, not a smash hit. And that's because Nintendo begrudgingly went to CDs, but their own tiny proprietary discs that didn't hold as much information as a DVD. So it just it didn't seem like this was going to be a huge thing. And then to Kelly's point, they played up their scarcity game so well that people were paying outrageous sums for these, fighting over them in stores and things like that. Actually, coincidentally, I got one almost immediately without even trying. Um, Somebody picked one up and was like, "Hey, do you want a Wii?" I was like, "Yeah," because they were able to get a few of them. So I had a Wii like day two that, that they were out, and I wasn't even planning on getting one at all. So I was a weird early adopter. And to Kelly's point, though, what Nintendo has always done well is make a game system that's more approachable. And that's something where they'll always, as long as they don't make Atari sized bad business decisions, they'll kind of always have a place in the market because they do appeal to a broad audience. And I feel that by and large, Xbox and PlayStation don't try to. I think that they have specifically targeted like more serious gamers, and that's where they're comfortable staying. And obviously, they do quite well there. So it's just a wide open market for Nintendo. And like Kelly said, I mean, this was something that multiple generations would gather around and play. I would still be explaining, Grand Theft Auto to an older family member to this day, and they still wouldn't get it. But they were doing great in Wii bowling.
Yep, 100%. The Dreamcast. Um, I'm trying to remember. I think we have talked about it some. Where are you at on this controller? Is this a good controller or a bad controller?
Um, So it wasn't as bad feeling as so I didn't buy a Dreamcast because like a lot of people and what ended up happening to the Dreamcast, Sega just absolutely killed consumer confidence at this point. And again, there were entire store chains that wouldn't carry their consoles anymore because of how poorly they handled the 32X and Saturn launch. So this was just dead in the water before it ever even came out. This was never a contender against PlayStation and Xbox. Never stood a chance. Um, the controller looks awful, absolutely awful. I did play a Dreamcast. My uncle had one. Um, it didn't feel as bad as it looks. Like playing the Jaguar controller feels as bad as it looks like it's going to. This wasn't that situation. I didn't like it though. Like if you could have swapped this out for a PlayStation controller, it would have been great.
Yeah, it looks like a pregnant Nintendo 64 controller.
Wow, that is a really solid analogy.
Which I don't think is necessarily a good thing, but I mean, at least they don't have the joystick in the center and all that. But as we've talked on a previous show, I don't hate the Nintendo 64 OG controller. I do like some of the new versions that have come out that have addressed some of the main challenges with it. But yeah, I mean, this was a system again that some pretty cool games for it. Not a huge library because of the confidence. Not only I mean, so you lose consumer confidence, you're not going to get developer confidence, so you're not going to have a very big library. Um, you know, it uh, I think we can thank it for being the precursor to the Amico and giving you a little on controller screen,
Yes, it did.
uh, but actually putting it in market. So that's a difference, I guess. But but
Yeah, the Dreamcast does exist. You can still
yeah,
buy
yeah,
these.
it's an actually thing, not just the box and the art for the box, but
Yeah.
yeah. And I think of all the systems out there, this is possibly you know, saying the controller aside, I think this is the best looking console for me. Uh, uh,
Yeah, it did have a nice kind of sleek look to it for the time. And like I said, I did play Dreamcast and the games it had solid games. And the controller doesn't feel as bad as you think it's going to. Looking at it, again, not great. I would take a PlayStation controller over this any day, but it's not as bad as you think it's going to be. The size of the controller is because of that screen, what Kelly was saying. So it had really large memory cards that you put into the controller similar to Nintendo 64, but they had like little LED screens on them and you would scroll through it on the screen on the controller as opposed to, choosing your games on the actual TV screen. I get what they were going for. It, in my opinion, wasn't implemented great and not worth it to make such a weird looking controller. But otherwise, again, the system was pretty cool. it famously is really good at retro gaming for that time. You could emulate other systems on there apparently pretty easily. Also, it was famous for not having the best copy protection. So you could easily burn games and play that on there as well. So it made it popular in certain circles that way. But Sega was just, they were never going to get their foothold back again.
The GameCube. So, we talked about Nintendo makes contact sometimes, sometimes swings and misses. It's kind of a foul ball, I think, to a degree. Um, Good controller, I think. Interesting design to it. Uh, had that, the thing that we've all been missing is I wish I had a game console that had a handle. And so finally that barrier has been broken with the GameCube. Um, Pretty big cult following over time. I think there's things that are pretty big fans. I think some of the games on are good quality, but again, the way the winds were blowing in the marketplace at this point, it was never going to carve out a huge swath, and it didn't.
Yeah, kind of the same thing. So at the time I didn't know anybody who had one. I did think it looked cool, and I played a few games on there, and it seemed pretty cool. Again though, I it you couldn't help but feel like every part of its design was done in spite or just really begrudgingly. Like Nintendo was fighting so hard not to switch to CDs because they were afraid of the copyright protection issues like you saw on Dreamcast. So when they finally do switch to discs, it's lower capacity, tiny discs that they manufacture themselves, not DVDs or mass produced CDs. So again, it just seems like why bother at that point? The controller is actually just a redesigned Nintendo 64 controller. It actually uses the same port, so you can use Nintendo 64 controllers on there. So again, they took a lot of crap over the Nintendo 64 controller. So instead of coming up with a new controller for this, they just did a redesign of that. So it just kind of feels like begrudgingly trying to force their ideas on people. The handle I always thought was interesting. I never saw somebody walking around with one of these like a purse. There is a rapper named Gmo Ski who I'm a fan of. He's a big gamer, but he is a huge Game Boy or GameCube guy. And like Kelly said, there is a cult following around this now. And there are multiple music videos where he's carrying around a GameCube, and it does look cool when he carries it around. So, I don't know if it's just him pulling off that look or if it would have looked cool back in the day, but I never actually saw somebody carrying one of these around.
Nope. The Xbox. Um, so we talked about packing games a little bit with Donkey Kong and ColecoVision. This one I think had a game with it, if I recall, or at least a game that a lunchtime game called Halo. So
I've
not a
heard of
packing.
that.
Yeah, it seemed to do okay. So not without its flaws, but entering the marketplace um, to kind of you know you had PC gaming quality and then you had console gaming quality, and there was always a bit of a gap. And this was one of the first ones that really um, narrowed that gap significantly.
Of course, Halo, one of the biggest game franchises of all time. Um, I wasn't an adopter of the first Xbox. I had friends who had it. There's a lot of great games for it, but I could see where they were trying to go with it, to Kelly's point about, bringing more of a PC gaming experience to a console. And it was very clear what they were trying to do, that this was going to be a contender with PlayStation, but in a different way, going for a somewhat different market, more of that PC gamer market. And again, of course, it's a Microsoft product, so that makes sense.
Yep. Gee, I don't know. You got anything to say about this system?
I never heard of it. I mean, this and PlayStation 2, in my opinion, are probably the best game systems ever created. Sega Genesis and PlayStation 2. Sega Genesis, they still make games for it. And I'm not talking about like homebrew games, like Sega still makes games for it. So they've published newer games with both of the mini console editions of this. They've had new official Sega published games for it. So I mean, we're 40 years, almost 30 something years into it. Not on this list, which I thought was surprising, is the Master System. Master System was Sega's 8-bit system. So there, before NES came out, Sega had Master System, which did well in Japan and insanely well in Brazil and South America and throughout South America, but especially Brazil. It's so popular in Brazil that they still manufacture it there. So the Sega Master System has been going for over 40 years now, and it's still actively being manufactured. So I mean, Sega always the Brazil thing is a different thing. We talked about Tectoy before. You can go and look up that episode and why it's so big there. But Sega kind of in the beginning was smart with their consoles and sort of future proofing them. So this had a 16-bit processor, but even though Super Nintendo came a couple years later, they still didn't have this high end of a processor. And Sega took the gamble of typically when you make a console, you lose a little bit of money on there with the hope that you'd make it back in software sales. Sega took a little bit of a gamble and decided to go with a much higher end processor. It's the same processor that was being used in PCs like the Amiga at the time, which is why a lot of Amiga ports of console games and vice versa are from Genesis. They're just ports of the Genesis games because they had the same processor in them. So essentially, this was the first one to at least under the hood start bridging that gap between PCs and consoles. It's also what gave it such a long lifespan. Even though Super Nintendo came a few years later, Super Nintendo, without question, looked and sounded better. It had a much bigger color palette, and it also had sample-based sounds with this, which this did not have. This was FM chip sounds. I always liked the FM sounds, but there's no question the sample-based sounds are brighter and clearer. But you put games side by side, even if the Super Nintendo one looks better, there's no question it plays faster and smoother on Genesis, even though it was the older hardware at the time, because it still had a better processor in it.
Yeah, and the games hold up better than most games across. Certainly better than Atari 2600 games, but many of it they do seem to hold up. But they punch above their weight for a really long time. So it's a pretty great system. Speaking of great systems, Nintendo 64, personal favorite of mine. The kind of like most in-home experience for me, 2600, the Telegames Series guy. And Nintendo 64. And this write up on it, they talk about it. It echoes the same thing that Mike and I have said pretty much anytime we talk about the Nintendo 64 and its biggest benefit, which is the world's most amazing controller. No, it's not that. We deal with the controller, but it's that idea of true kind of the in a room, 4 people playing, having some fun playing Mario Kart. Can't beat it. It excels on that multiplayer kind of fun aspect, Mario Party, all that good stuff. Strange system in some ways, cartridge based still at this point, although there was, I think, an attempt at some point to introduce what was going to be a CD component, but Nintendo's and CDs, Mike's kind of already covered theirs. It wasn't a match made in heaven to begin with, so that never kind of worked out. But the 64 was a fun, accessible system, and there's still just a ton of games on it that are really fun to play.
Yeah, so I'm a super late comer to this, like a year ago to the Nintendo 64. I didn't have one when it came out. I had no interest in getting it. PlayStation was out at that point, and the reality is the PlayStation games capacity wise could just hold so much more. Not only did they insist on sticking with cartridges, but they were very small capacity cartridges even for that time. There were larger cartridges for Genesis games than there were for Nintendo 64 games. It just didn't make sense. And it lost them a lot of third party support because of it. Square being the biggest one, and they lost the Final Fantasy series because of it. Final Fantasy VII, which is probably the best-selling game of that console generation, was originally being developed for this and had to be moved over to PlayStation. It is multiple CD-ROMs long. You would have had to have 20 of these cartridges to play the game. It just wasn't practical to do it. And unfortunately, that cost them fans and some people. And the system wasn't a failure the way that like Saturn was a failure, Jaguar was a failure, but it just didn't match the heights of what you'd expect from Nintendo coming out. So, which is a shame because it kept people like me away from it. And I absolutely love this system now, even with the controller, which I don't think is great. But the system itself, I think, is fantastic. There's a lot of really fun games for this. And to Kelly's point, I mean, just the fact that it is built around this kind of four-player setup just makes it the perfect sort of multiplayer party kind of game system, in my opinion.
Yep. Yeah. So, again, struggle a little bit with this list because it's like, okay, so you're going from the beginning of time at the 2600 to PlayStation 4. So a little confusing there, I guess. Um, at least kind of the main headline of this was, I think, PlayStation 4. Its main job was to fix all the problems with PlayStation 3.
Yeah, I mean, that's just what it seemed like to me. Like PlayStation 3, there were some good ideas there, but there was just a lot of problems with the execution. And this felt more like an update. Like, oh, we fixed all that shit that was broken. Come back.
Yeah. And also I think a pretty decent looking box. I mean, the consoles, it's, little futuristic, kind of modern looking. PlayStation controller. I mean, like all PlayStation controllers, different feature sets and all that. Huh. The Game Boy. So we have a recent Game Boy purchaser online. I'd like to visit, so hand it over to him to tell us, why did you go buy a Game Boy?
So I've always loved Game Boy. I was an early adopter of Game Boy. I don't remember how I got it. It must have been a Christmas gift. But it was when it first came out. So even like I remember I was always kind of behind my friends on game systems. It seemed like they would get them months before I would. But Game Boy, I was the first one to have one. So it took a while for everybody else to kind of catch up on it. And I loved it. I mean, you could get almost Nintendo comparable games on here. Things had to be scaled down and it was not in color and things like that, but it had good battery life compared to its competition. So that made up the difference there. More importantly, though, not only is there still a huge Indian homebrew market for the Game Boy, but you watching this video right now can pick up a Game Boy and take control of Kelly, pounding beers, slapping people, running from the cops. Basically, a Tuesday night for this guy.
It's it's slapping implied.
Implied slapping. We should get an ESRB rating for it just so we can put like in the content
implied,
descriptor implied slapping.
implied slapping is one of the. That would be good. Yeah, yeah. I mean, with the accept, agree with everything you're saying, and in terms of, I mean, really kind of a groundbreaker and getting the handheld out, and a really kind of very reasonable handheld for the time. Could have used a brighter screen, man. Could have
Yeah,
really,
I mean,
really used it.
I really forgot. I remember that it wasn't backlit, but picking up a Game Boy Color now so that I can play Slapdash like down there, on there, man, it's so not backlit. It's it's far more profound than you remember it when you had younger eyes.
Yeah, and just I think probably should pause the video at this point to say this isn't just simply a paid commercial for Slapdash, paid content, but
Yeah, we
because
made Slapdash, so this isn't a commercial.
that's right, and it's free, so we're not even trying to sell it. But
Yeah,
download it, play it. It's great. Lots of different versions. We're coming up on the spooky season, so you'll be able to get a version appropriate for that holiday edition as well.
and the port to Game Boy Color, which is the first port of Slapdash.
There you go. So the Xbox 360. So now we get into kind of the more multiplayer online play. It started to be introduced in different spaces. So this wasn't groundbreaking there, but this one kind of creating the online marketplace so that more and more uh, there's ready access to more homebrew content and other things as well. The 360 was a big thing, big powerful system. Um, Xbox has always been, I mean, in terms of just the horsepower and the engineering behind it, it's been good. Uh, and a very reasonable successor to the Xbox.
Yeah, I liked 360. Again, I during the time PlayStation 3 and this came out, I was selling electronics as a part-time job. So I got to see these hooked up every day and play around with them. And even though technically PlayStation 3 looked a little better on paper, this just didn't have the same issues that it did. It also had an adapter to play HD DVDs. And putting aside the whole Evil Bong thing, HD DVDs, the early ones, were actually way better than Blu-ray. That's not how people remember it, but in you never actually saw an HD DVD. Most of you watched this, so let me explain to you. All of the really cool features that eventually got added to Blu-rays, like downloadable content and watch along sessions and all that kind of stuff. HD DVD did that from day one. Like all of the stuff that those later could do. So, and there was even bigger capacity HD DVDs coming out and things like that, but it just never took off. And again, there's this company called Warner Brothers that really, really backed it with tons and tons of money, not because they wanted to win. They were just trying to keep Blu-ray from overtaking the market the way that DVD did. And they did so successfully because now most people stream content. And that's all entirely because of Warner Brothers. They started making deals with different companies so that they could stream content. And I know personally that basically an entire generation has discovered Evil Bong through Xbox. I remember people coming up to me at conventions and things like that, and that's how they saw it. Because even though, like, we really benefited from the fact that it was kind of the last gasp of video stores. So I got to go to a video store and see a wall of Evil Bong DVDs, which was awesome. Because that's something that anybody who works on a tiny movie now will never see. Going into a store and seeing their movie like that. So that was really cool. But it was really this that made the difference because now younger people who didn't care at all about going into video stores turned on their Xbox. And this is the same that when I bought an Xbox from the electronics store that I worked at, I bought a 360, took it home, went into the like media section, and the first thing on there was Evil Bob. So I mean, this is what millions of people saw, and literally millions of people saw that movie because of this. So I have a weird nostalgia for it, even though it's not that old, just because of that. Never heard of it.
Yeah, NES, funny looking system.
It is
The
ugly though, right? Like looking back on it now.
not it's not I mean it looks electronic-y. It's got like, oh, this must do things, but in a much more utilitarian this is a mobile garbage disposal kind of way versus
It looks like an appliance now
yeah, it
to
does.
me.
It really does. It's kind of a toaster that's fallen and can't get up. But it's kind of the kind of resurrection of the 2600. So whereas 2600 broke in, and, oh, you really, this can happen. It can be in your house, and everybody kind of said, oh, I guess it can. And then there was a kind of a love affair, and then everybody fell out of love, and they're like, I'm never going to have one of those in my house again. I see how this story ends. And but Nintendo did some convincing and put out a system that uh, kind of, for many of the same factors, wow, there's some really enjoyable games that I can play now that expectations were higher and people wanted more than the graphic quality of Halloween on the Atari 2600. This came out. So kind of an important system. Seems to be five's a pretty good spot for it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, again, along. probably next to 2600, this has to be the next most iconic and well-known game system. And just like 2600, this brought people back to gaming. Because 2600 kind of ruined it, like Kelly said, for a lot of people, and just tanked the market. And this really single-handedly brought it back. And so many of these games are still fun to play today. And if you want to, if you're like me, if you're over 40, play on an original Nintendo controller and see how long you can do it before it feels like somebody beat your hands with a hammer.
Yeah, yeah, because even the controller's not. It's all so boxy
It's a
and
tiny box. Yeah. It's it's about the length of my palm, the entire box.
so here's just something this thing that Sony was working on that Nintendo didn't buy into. All
Yeah.
this um the start of a controller that continues to go through Botox and slightly different adjustments here and there, but has stayed somewhat true in spirit to what they started off with the PlayStation, another kind of super significant delivery where you get kind of the true CD game based system, good quality in terms of it's a reliable system. Unlike what they got to the third one, they forgot about reliability, but this one was super reliable. And of course, it's the home for Phantom Menace on the PlayStation, which in and of itself justifies its existence. Because if you haven't played Phantom Menace on the PlayStation, you haven't lived. So you need to do that. And you won't live very long because several of the early levels are brutally difficult. But it's worth it because eventually you can go mow down an entire city of people with no consequence,
Nice.
which is what
Just
I
like
play.
a government.
Yeah. Um, I don't know what I mean. It's a biggie. Also very deserving of the top five.
Yeah, I mean, PlayStation deserves to be on this list in some upper position. That controller, I mean, not even talking about the PlayStation hardware itself, that control, like the system itself, that controller, maybe the most iconic controller at this point, because not only has Sony continued to just do subtle redesigns of it, it's been ripped off by every third party controller that's come along. Has done some variation on this. So, I mean, controller design, I feel like it peaked with PlayStation and Xbox. So, yeah. And to to what Kelly was saying, so this is the Super Nintendo PlayStation. So to compete with Genesis, Nintendo flirted with the idea of adding a CD drive. They partnered with Sony to do this, and they were working on the Nintendo PlayStation, which would be an add-on to the Super Nintendo. And then Nintendo was like, "Nah, we don't need Sony. Why would we give these people some of our revenue?" And Sony didn't take it well because they were pretty far into develop. Like there is Nintendo PlayStation models that that there are pictures of and things like that. So they were pretty far into the development of it. And Nintendo was like, "Yeah, we don't need you. Go away." And Sony was like, "This isn't the last you've heard from me," in a very Scooby Doo kind of way. And Nintendo was like, "Yeah, whatever." And it bit them. It came back and bit them.
Yep. And this is the last PlayStation that kind of flies the Nintendo color flag because
Yeah,
immediately after PlayStation, we're back in black the rest of the way through. So
yeah. And the real slap in the face came when they stole the Final Fantasy series away from Nintendo. Because once this came out and Nintendo unveiled the Nintendo 64, it didn't take long for Square to realize that it was just never going to play on there without doing multiple cartridges and some impossible swap out system. So once they got Final Fantasy, that was the big system seller. I didn't even play, like myself and many people I knew didn't even play RPGs. And we all had Final Fantasy 7.
don't underestimate the power of Phantom Menace, though. Another big thing. The Nintendo DS, two screens of fun, touchscreen, portable, communicate across with other folks. Pretty cool, sweet little system. Um, Clamshell design, that's a risk. you know, things break, and this is a type of thing there, but very innovative. And so going back to kind of Den of Geeks criterion, I'm sure that this went off the charts on innovation just in terms of reimagining what a handheld um, configuration should be and look like. Uh, and so pretty sweet little system. It's right on the edge of plastic to screen ratio of having a problem. Like, I'll give it a pass, but it's in the yellow zone for me on that.
Yeah, so I was never too big on the DS, although again, to Kelly's point, I mean, it was very innovative for the time. There wasn't a ton of games that really spoke to me for the DS. My wife had one though, and she loved it. Which again, going back to Nintendo's strengths, she's not a huge gamer. She's actually a giant Nintendo 64 fan. That's how I ended up getting into it. Kelly Sherpa'd me through picking up a Nintendo 64 and some games for her as part of an anniversary gift about a year ago. And since then, I've become a huge fan of the system. But she's definitely a casual gamer. She's into stuff like Mario Kart and all that kind of stuff. So, and again, she loved her DS. She still has it. She still pulls it out every once in a while. So it goes to the strength of Nintendo of hitting that casual gamer market.
Yeah, because really even the 64, um, you don't have to have. I mean, there were some games on 64 required a little more cycling through, but you don't have the Grand Theft Auto um, tool set. You got to keep in mind to do it, and this different input kind of factors and all that. Really cool system. So if you thought the Nintendo was good, the Super Nintendo would be even better. And it was in terms of quality of games. One of those ones where the sequel, you're following a tough something Atari really didn't manage to pull off, but Nintendo did, is to kind of say, let me take a big success and come out with a second one that is even better, with probably the biggest benefit being now if you have just normal size hands, not even monster hands, you now have a controller that you can probably utilize. And it looks better. Still not great, but it looks better.
Yeah, this controller was a gigantic step in the right direction for Nintendo because Genesis was already out. Genesis had a much larger controller for people who have monster hands like me. That was great. Um, Super Nintendo is weird because I think it's a fantastic system, one of the best ever. I wouldn't put it above Genesis, but one of the best ever without question. It would be in my top five or whatever. Um, one of the best ever. Its strength though lies with games that are developed for Super Nintendo because otherwise you're getting into that Sega versus Nintendo debate. And really, it comes down to games tended to look and sound better on Super Nintendo, but played way better on Genesis. And when you're a kid, you can get caught up in the bells and whistles of graphics and things like that. But the game I always tell people to play back to back is Mortal Kombat. Go on your Super Console X or original hardware and play Mortal Kombat for both. It is night and day, and you'll immediately see the strengths and weaknesses of both systems. This had a much wider color palette, so you get a lot more detail in the characters. It also sounds the Genesis version actually sounds really good, I think, but it's not accurate to the arcade games. They had to redo everything to fit the Genesis sound chip, whereas this just has samples taken directly from the arcade game. However, the game does not play at all like the arcade game. Whereas the Genesis game, they even bragged about how easy it was to port all of the actual gameplay elements directly to the Genesis without having to change anything. That it is just huge chunks of the original arcade programming code just move right over to a Genesis cartridge. It takes big hits visually and sound wise, but it plays almost identical to the arcade game. So I mean, they are night and day when you're controlling the characters. So games that are made for this though were fantastic. Super Castlevania 4, I think, is one of the greatest games of all time. Millions of people will tell you Star Fox is one of the greatest games of all time. I'm not a flight game guy too much, but Star Fox looked amazing for that time, and so many other ones. Donkey Kong Country with pre-rendered 3D characters and things like that. There's so many great games for it. So definitely, without question, belongs near the top of the list for me.
And then wrapping it up, PlayStation 2, 155 million units sold, biggest seller ever. Um, has uh, outlasted two PlayStation 3s in my household. It's still trudging away with less issues. Every once in a while, the PlayStation 3 gets a little funky. I got to kind of mess with it a little bit. This guy, no problem. It did have, we talked about the benefit earlier, trying to make the pitch to bring in a gaming console, but it's also a DVD player. So this introduced that kind of, again, that multimedia kind of type of thing. It's early days, so you do have to deal with memory cards, and that was not wonderful. But there's a kind of controller again that continues to just get a little Botox here and there, and it's good. Kind of good stuff there. But a nice system. Probably as about as boxy as like the Nintendo, but oddly enough, looks better. I don't know if it's the palette it's in or whatever, but it looks more like a gaming system than the toaster of the NES.
Yeah, I mean, I without question, this is. I mean, this belongs at number one. Like I said, I kind of flip flop back and forth as far as preference with Genesis and this, but I mean, I've probably logged as much time on this as any game system. And for most people, this was their first introduction to DVDs. And not only did that give Sony a leg up as far as the home media formats of taking over the market at that time, because there were other DVD was out for a while, which most people don't realize. DVDs came out in the mid 90s, which a lot of people don't realize how old DVD already was at this point. But DVD was making a lot of the same mistakes that other disc based media had made. It was very expensive. It was really cumbersome. Originally, you needed an external drive that you could only hook up to a PC. And then the first standalone DVD players were like $1,000 and things like that. So it was just making a lot of mistakes. So this really streamlined it to where it was like, hey, for a few $100s, which is cheaper than most DVD players at the time, you could get a game system and a DVD player. And because DVDs had a larger storage capacity than CDs, the games looked a whole generation better than what had come before it. This wasn't something you had to explain to people, they could just easily see. The games looked better, there was more content, and you could watch movies on this.
Those are our thoughts. And Mike always thinks he's right. So don't really try and sway him, but I'm open. So if you feel differently, let me know in the comments what you disagreed with me about. I'll hear you out. May not agree, but I'll at least listen. But yeah, we would like to hear from you if there's anything you feel is missing here or think we really missed the boat on any of these. It is, to your point, Mike, and I really hadn't fully thought it through. This is a confusing list to go through because it's this odd blend of consoles and handhelds, but it was still kind of good to go through the history books a little bit on these and kind of see the evolution. But we'd appreciate it if you like this kind of content to subscribe to the Bog Panda YouTube channel, hit that bell so you'll be notified when new content comes out. Content such as Hard No, the world's shortest podcast, available daily. Hard No never breaks down, super reliable. So you can watch Hard No. No show over a minute, although Mike pushes that envelope every once in a while. And we'll work on it. We got a merchandise store. Maybe stop by there and take a peek. There's a variety of shirts out there, including a Mari Who t-shirt related to the game that we're not plugging at all called Slapdash. Links below. You can check that out, as well as Slapdash Scary Season and War on Christmas is out without a cover yet, or is there a cover coming for that?
There's a cover coming for that, as well as the cover art is already done for the Game Boy Color board.
Gotcha. So lots of versions out there. Check our website out. It's got a special. There's the Bong Pandavision section, which is where our software development work comes out. So you'll continue to see various things out there. Lots of Slapdash, other things too, but lots of Slapdash. And anything else
And
you'd like to?
Kelly as a pitch man is branching out too with hot sauce, slap sauce.
Yeah, there's that. There's that. Um, uh, which is not on the market currently, not orderable in the merchandise store yet. But maybe we'll get a T-shirt. We'll have to sort that out. That would be uh, interesting. So we'll see. All right. Well, anything else to say before we wrap it up, sir?
No, I think that's it, sir.
Cool. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bog Panda.